Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I was introduced already, but yeah, my name is Peter Wells. I'm the CEO of SmartWires. I actually have about 30 years of industry experience in energy. I did a decade in wind energy, and about a year and a half ago, realizing that there was something not quite right with how wind was getting onto the grid, I started to get a little bit more interested in what was happening with the grid and why that was, in fact, a bottleneck and perhaps a problem to the issues we need to solve. So I moved into the company called SmartWires. Let's take a step back and think about the grid for a second. I think it's fair to say that it's probably one of the greatest inventions of the last century. But I think the thing that most people don't realize or think about is it actually has to be the greatest tech story of the next century too, and I'll give you a sense on why that's the case. As Katerina mentioned, we're all about focusing on modernizing the grid, and that means digitalizing the grid, and I'll explain a little bit more about why that's so important. So, if you think about energy transition, it's a pretty broad paradigm, but at one end of the scale, you've got huge scale adoption of renewable energy. This means phasing out coal and nuclear and other plants. Physically where they are, the generation is moving to new locations, much more distributed. This creates new challenges for the grid. It wasn't wired and set up for this paradigm. In addition, on the other end of the scale, when you think about on the demand side, you've got electrification, batteries, distributed generation, solar, etc. Incredibly complicated new situation for the grid. It was not set up for this in mind, and really, if you look at the technologies that are out there today, you're dealing often with 30, 40, 50-year-old legacy technologies. They can't adopt and deal with this new situation. We know as well that investment in the grid needs to double from 30 billion to 60 billion euros a year just in Europe, and I'll explain again why that's the case. So if I put this sort of changing paradigm of energy transition at the top of the page here, on one side of the page you've got renewable energy adoption. If you saw the recent IEA report, it needs to go up by 4x. We're not even close. So if you think about net zero goals, we're not even close to what we need to be doing. At the other end of the scale, e-mobility, electrification, meaning using greener energy, industrial process and heating, building heating and cooling. All of these different things have to happen, cannot happen unless the grid enables it. So the grid is the nexus of the energy transition. So it must connect these new technologies on the generation side. And I would argue it must also enable much, much more innovation on the demand side as well. So it's right in the middle. It comes with a challenge. And the challenges I map here for you, it's a lot more complex, to be honest with you, than this. But if we talk about congestion issues, large interconnect queues, in the US alone, something like 3 to 7 years is the average time to get a new renewable project onto the grid. So if you want the scale of adoption and the pace of adoption, the grid has to become something different. Stability, strength, resilience, harmonics, the ability to plan and forecast, this new now two-way flow of information and energy, fluctuations during the day, big load management challenges, especially on distribution, and the ability to balance demand and supply, are all new challenges for the grid and the grid operators. So how can we solve those? Often referred to as a family of grid-enhancing technologies, and you'll see there's plenty of reports out in Europe and across the US on these areas. And they're typically talking about modular power flow control, they're talking about dynamic line rating, data science, grid topology, really understanding what the asset looks like today and how to adapt to modernize that asset to give real-time, I would say, intelligence and real-time control. So we put it really in our world, we put it into these three buckets of what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at applications of the technology to solve these problems, very specific. We're then realizing that as we distribute more of the technology, there's the ability to layer services on top of that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the grid becoming a digital platform. And that's where we play as a company, right in that middle, the bottom zone there, trying to make sure the grid can become this digital platform. As a company based in the US, listed here on the on Nasdaq First North in Stockholm, we have a global presence. We've got offices across Europe. We have offices in Australia and also South America and Colombia. We're about 165 people right now. It's gone up almost by, I would say, 5 or so a week at the moment, so we're in a pretty rapid phase of growth. We also have a couple of key partners. Our manufacturing is done by contract and outsourced to a company called Jabil in Florida. Strong patent portfolio, pretty long history actually. We've been around for 10 years developing and refining this technology. Big pipeline on sales, actually close to 6 billion now. We've got 60 million in backlog for this year already, and we're targeting 65 to 70 million of revenue this year. So what do we offer? I mentioned a couple of things, but let me be more specific for you. So we do two things really. One is on the analytical side, we do very complex, we're using advanced software, we do very complex modeling, and basically we're looking at the ability for the grid to adopt new technologies, take on new generation, new load, solve problems on the grid, whether that's congestion or strength or resilience. And we've worked with utilities across the world on these studies. Obviously, no surprise, many of those studies lead to the application of the smart valve. And that's the core technology you see in the picture on the right here. Give you a sense of scale, one of these units would be about 5 meters long, 2 meters by 2 meters. This is a transformerless, so it's pretty radical. If you look at the grid today and the technologies, lots of steel, lots of copper, magnetic and mechanical switching devices, none of that is in a smart valve. It's all power electronics. And we're using basically this more advanced technology to inject voltage onto the line. And when we inject voltage onto the line, we can change the impedance, meaning the resistance, and we can change the power flow. And I'll give you a picture in a second of a model simplified of what that looks like. But this is, just to be clear, this is quite radical for the grid, this technology. Something that is modular, flexible, scalable, and controllable. So we can put these groups of modules, they're typically going to go in for 25 to 40 years of life, but we can scale up and down as the grid needs change, and we can move them. You just simply don't see anything like that on the grid today, not even close. So, taking the power and flexibility of silicon software to move faster and provide better solutions. And the key, I think, as well, I often talk about this with customers, is future-proofing. So we don't know, maybe some of you do, but I don't. If you go 5 years out, maybe we have a sense for what the energy transition looks like. 10 years? 15 years? 20 years? I don't think so. This technology is great for that because of that adaptability and the scalability and the modularity. So the smart valve itself, strong patent portfolio. What's unique about it? I've touched on some of these things already. So it's modular. We know we use these silicon-based converters. We have really advanced diagnostics and analytical capability sets, very unique communication capabilities and controls. We can do things for the system operator. If you think about the ability to turn loads up and down, really scaling and moving in small steps, can't be done today, and you can do this with this device. So we can solve problems on the grid, but we can also give this ability to optimize power flow across existing assets. Not against new investment in the grid, to be clear. That's important too. But this technology can also help get better utilization of new investments. The patent portfolio, most of it's been registered in the US, but 35% or so worldwide. We're really focusing on the core technology itself when we do our patents. But we've also spent a lot of time thinking about these other attributes I mentioned, the modularity, the scalability, and things like this. And we put patents around those. Over 100, 140 or so that are either filed or in drafting as well. So this patent portfolio continues to move up. When I joined about a year ago, it was around about 45 or so. Interestingly, when you look at patents, and it's a key thing to understand, prior art is a big deal. There were the patents like this in this area before. With our technology, there are none. So there's no prior art. This means that we have very unique technology. It also means, significantly, if other companies move into our space, we will have a much earlier priority date on any considerations about patent infringement. So it puts us in a strong position. So I mentioned about trying to give you a sense of how this works. And I'm not the brains, the engineer behind this, so I always tell people this is my street story for you. So I'll explain what's going on. So the picture on the left, this is not uncommon. So as you bring more renewable energy generation onto the grid, what's happening is that power flow will always go to the line with the least resistance. That's just basic physics. But when that line reaches capacity or its specification limit, it can't take any more power. So when you want to add more renewable, or even if that renewable energy is available and you've reached that maximum point, you have to curtail those assets or turn them down. When you drive around Europe, if you see wind farms that aren't moving, it's not because they're not working. Typically, that's because the operator cannot take that power, and they've asked them to curtail or shut down the generation. You as a consumer still need your electricity. Where is that coming from now? It's coming from a different place on the grid, and often it's coming from coal or gas or nuclear. And often that comes at a price premium. So you pay it once in your bill, and secondarily, you pay for it with the climate. So as a consumer, you should be, in my opinion, hopping mad about this. So we have to solve it. So there are ways you can do it. As a utility, I could decide to add a new line. That would bring more capacity. Doesn't change the efficiency of how the grid is working, but I can add a new line. I could reconductor some of these lines here. That will help too. That will add capacity. How many years for that? Any guesses? 5 years, 10 years? Get the permits, do the work, and now it's there. It's fixed, it's rigid. It can't be adapted or really flexed in any way whatsoever. And you can put transformers and other things there, but again, they're 3-4 years to design and implement, and they're quite rigid in their deployment, meaning they're not flexible for future change. When we put the smart valves on the lines, we're not adding lines, we're not modernizing those lines, we're simply adding the smart valves. We're able to inject voltage. Basically, we do it at a different quadrature to the AC signal. When we do that, we're changing the impedance or the resistance on the line. We can make it, from a synthetic standpoint, higher or lower, and we push and pull power flow across the existing grid. We can balance out the load, and we can add capacity. In this model we did in the UK, on this specific circuit, it added 500 megawatts. Pretty big wind farm. So what are we doing? We have some key advantages, I would say. Very quick integration of renewables and new loads. We're really improving the grid flexibility, reliability, and resilience. And we're, I would say, in a much, much bigger way than any other technologies out there, impact now. This, as I tell anybody that will listen to me, is a politician's dream. It means you can add capacity and do something very significant, typically within 1 or 2 years. There's not many other technologies that will do that. If you want re-election, depending on where you are in the world, I think to show that kind of impact is a pretty big deal. So as I look at the outlook for growth, I'd step you back through the applications, services platform. These are the big step changes we see in the market. We're obviously, as a company, at the beginning phase here in the applications, very specific need cases that we model the smart valves for and deploy. There's a $6 billion pipeline that we're tracking right now. Specific projects, known scale and size, known deployment date, known location, et cetera, et cetera. These are committed capital plans for system operators across the world. So that really is about, for us in the near term, really the conversion of that opportunity. Moving then beyond that into the application of services layered on top of the technology. And as I said, the ultimate is to make sure the grid gets this digital paradigm or a digital platform. Again, I think this is going to become a super interesting time for energy when the grid really is at this point. How much innovation can we unleash on both the generation and the demand side? So adoption, scale, and then gradually transitioning to more of an annuity-based revenue stream. So what's that looking like today? I'll give you 3 examples. In the UK, we did a large project for National Grid last year. We added actually in that project 1.5 gigawatts. It was 43 smart valves, 5 locations, 3 circuits. Saved the consumer $400 million. We have expansion projects with them this year. And then we can see with the capital plans, we see a large number of projects coming on a yearly basis for the next 5 to 10 years. In Colombia, super interesting region. Again, we've worked with most of the system operators in Colombia. We've solved some very unique and interesting problems, and sometimes, in fact, even getting cheaper, cleaner power to regions that are more, I would say, affected by poverty. So there's a nice social benefit there as well. But again, expansion projects this year, expansion projects next year, not just Colombia. These customers are now taking us in to Peru, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, and so on. And then lastly, just to talk about Australia, again, repeat business, unleashing new capacity for renewables, saving money for the consumer, and we again have expansion plans this year. So this is all about platform adoption and how once we do a project, we see this repeatability with the customer year over year. So we're positioned for strong and sustained growth. We're obviously focused very much on creating this digital grid solution. Our technology is patented, it is transformational. We're thinking about, obviously as a company, industrialization and scale. It's super important as a business. We're very professional in the way that we drive our business, the way we operate, and that as we hit that tipping point of adoption, we can scale rapidly. And as we evolve, we know that the platform will drive to more annuity revenue streams. We're much more of a project-based technology sale business today, but we see annuity streams evolving, I would say, in the midterm. And let's be real about this for a second. This energy transition that we're working our way through, we've been talking about it a long time. I was in wind for 10 years, but I can tell you we've scratched the surface. We're not even close to doing what we need to be doing, and what's coming is going to be, I think, incredible. The scale and pace of adoption of renewable needs to go up 4x, as I mentioned earlier. I think the stuff we'll see on the demand side, on the distribution side, will be super interesting. So get ready. If any of you remember the telecoms of the late 90s versus what it is today, think about that change in this space. That's what's coming. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Robert. Question, main challenges for this year, 2022, for you?
The same ones as last year. So that would be obviously technology adoption. We still continue to work with utilities to adopt the technology. And moving that utility customer segment forward can take time. So that's one of them. And then the other piece is industrialization. Supply chains and logistics are still really tough right now. The Russian invasion of Ukraine probably doesn't help that a whole lot either. So these things are the things we worry about the most. Yeah.
So in terms of what you would dream of, or what you need in order to really transition forward quicker, what would that be? Is it legislation or is it more funds? What is your primary design here?
So two things. Yeah, that's a great question. So two things. If you look, and I didn't mention this in the presentation, but often if you look at market design, it's quite ironic that market designs in different countries don't always incentivize the utilities to be the most progressive. And in many ways, they sometimes do the opposite. So the irony of the market design versus what we need in energy transition is not lost on me, and it shouldn't be lost on you either. It's pretty bad. And in some countries, I think it's borderline criminal. You know, just the way it's set up is pretty bad. It's evolving and changing, and some countries are being really progressive now and really pushing it, but we have to keep an eye on that. This repower push for Europe now to move away from dependency from Russia, you know, there's things you have to do to make that real, and it's not the technology. It's often the market design, so that would be the first and foremost. The second one is a cultural thing, and I often think of I think the environment within our customer segment it's such a risk adverse, for good reason. They have mission critical assets, but very risk adverse. And often I think of the engineers we speak to as the no engineers. And so how do we change the no to a yes and get people to think about what they can do to make these changes happen?
You mentioned the IT transition and the similarities. Is there anything we can learn from that and putting it to this new field that we need to transition quicker into?
Yeah, so very different spaces, and I think the pace and what we're going to be able to do in the grid will probably not be as radical as we saw in telecoms and communications. But I think the biggest single lesson to learn is that probably the pace and just the breadth of change that came was so surprising and so fast, and I think that's what we should expect on the grid side as well.
So we need to hold on to our hats.
Yes, let's do that.
Thank you very much, Robert.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.